Hi, TikTok. This is Miss Regine from Soar Educational Services, and I am back to continue my series on immigration policy, the history of immigration in the United States. So we are in the period after the Civil War. So following the Civil War, we're getting a lot more immigrants from different regions, so such as Southern and Eastern Europe. If you think about it, in 1917, Russia had its own revolution, the Russian Revolution, where the king and his family were killed. So you had immigrants coming that way from that country, from Russia, and we had the end of World War One, and Austria-Hungary, and that many of that whole empire fell, and so you had immigrants coming from there. And in addition, we also had a lot of immigrants coming from China. They initially came to work on the railroad, but as early as 1875, through the Page Act, the U.S. government was looking at ways to restrict immigration of Chinese laborers. And by 1880, there were 105,000 Chinese immigrants in this country, which already that the U.S. government thought, okay, we have too many as it is. So the Immigration Act of 1882 put a 50-cent tax on every non-U.S. citizen arriving by ship. And this was, sort of a deterrent, but also the money was used to help manage immigration. And the law also allowed the U.S. to check passengers and turn away any convicts, mentally ill, or those unable to support themselves. But now, specifically to try to limit Chinese immigrant, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It stopped Chinese laborers from coming into the country and allowed the government to deport Chinese people who were already living here. And this act was repeatedly extended up until 1943. And in 1888, the Scott Act denied re-entry to Chinese people who left the country, and the Supreme Court upheld this act. Now, after the Civil War and the 14th Amendment was passed, the right of citizenship was granted to people born on the soil. We call that the right of soil. Those born on U.S. soil are automatically granted U.S. citizenship. But that was challenged in court in 1898 with the United States versus Wong. And there was a Chinese immigrant, a man who his parents were Chinese immigrant, and he was actually born on the soil. So he left the country, and when he attempted to re-enter, he was denied re-entry. And the Supreme Court upheld this, saying that his parents could not become citizens because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, so neither could he. So that kind of undermined the whole right to soil. So we see that there were time period where, even though it was actually very close, right after, the 14th Amendment, maybe 30 years or so, and already that had been challenged. And as I said, the Chinese Exclusionary Act kept being reapproved year after year. So in the years of around the time of World War I, early 20th century, there was a lot of anti-immigration sentiment. So as I said, immigrants were coming from different parts of the world, that the U.S. was used to, immigrants from the Western Europe and Northern Europe. So they were not pleased with the Southern European, the Eastern European, and certainly not the Chinese immigrant. So during World War I, Americans became even more anti-immigrant, especially because we were fighting, and we really wanted to be sort of like isolationists at this point. The Immigration Act of 1917 was passed by Congress over President Woodrow Wilson's veto. He was not such an isolationist, but the mood of the country was isolationism. It marked one of the most restrictive immigration law in American history up to that time. Immigrants over 16 had to demonstrate basic literacy in any language to be able to enter. And part of it was to reduce the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration from Asia was pretty much prohibited, and it raised the tax that immigrants had to pay when entering the U.S. And then to further limit the number of immigrants coming from what they would call, unfavorable part of the country, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was passed. So what this did was set a quota on the number of new immigrants allowed in this country by nationality. And they looked at the 1910 census and they looked at, okay, this was the number of immigrants that came to this country from Britain and Germany and Russia and, well, we know China was just out. They looked at that and they're like, well, the number of immigrants that can come into this country as of 1921 has to be 3% of the foreign-born person of that nationality present as of the 1910 census. So this was a way to keep the balance, so that way there was not an influx of immigrant coming from like Southern and Eastern Europe. So it allocated 358 total immigration to Europe, 55% to Northern and Western Europe, because as of 1910, that is where most of the immigrants were coming. Although, like I said, following the Civil War, there was starting to be a growth in Southern and Eastern European immigrant. So they just wanted to make sure to keep that limit. And then in 1924, the National Origins Quota Act was extended, this limited the number of people who could come to the U.S. from other country. It reduced it to 2% of each nationality, based on. Okay, as I was saying, the 1924 National Origin Quota Act limited the number of people who could come to the U.S., and it limited to 2% of the nationalities that existed as of 1890. This drastically cut the number of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. It set an annual cap of 164,000 immigrants. So again, down from that 358,000. It completely banned immigration from Asia. 82% of the numbers went to Western and Northern Europe. So this is up from 55%. And as I said, this was just specifically targeted to try to limit where the immigrants were coming from, and to keep that wanted to keep a consistency in the culture and the nationality and race of people living in the U.S. So we had a former state senator, this I believe was 1924, Edwin Grant, stated, "The prosperity made possible by our forefathers has lured the parasites of Europe, the scums that could so well have been eliminated from the melting pot." So there was this strong belief that people from Southern and Eastern Europe could not assimilate into the U.S. Now, ironically, the Immigration Act of 1924 did not prohibit Mexican. Part of it was because there was not a large number of Mexicans coming at the time. Some may have come, temporarily for work, but then they would return. In 1940 census, the category was removed and Mexicans were classified as white. Border crossing occurred, but not as high as a level. But in the early 1900s, Border Patrol was created because there was starting to be a growth in that. But again, because when the Immigration Act of 1924, the National Origin Quota Act, when those were created, since Mexicans were not seen as a big problem of Mexican immigrant coming in, they were not included in that. But they will be, because during the Great Depression, more than 1 million people of Mexican descent came to this country. And as the numbers started to creep up, new policies were developed to handle that. But we'll talk about more about that next time. So see you later. Bye.